So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to the latest in this continuing series, it seems, of custom scenarios that people have made, and we return to one of Flame of Arnor's pieces of work today. And this is a variation on a variation of Thranduil's Halls, and that wasn't me repeating myself because I made a mistake. That is the truth of the matter, because I do believe I have seen a version of this edit of Thranduil's Halls before. So the actual interior of Thranduil's Halls, as we actually look in here, is largely the same as the one that we have seen several times at this point, and indeed we will be seeing the old version of Thranduil's Halls at some point within the next few weeks as well, because Winged Swordsman sent me a battle replay on that particular map as well, so we will get to compare and contrast these, albeit not directly. But I have also shown this edit before in a certain sense, although some of the terrain features are new, and those are the edits that Flame of Arnor has decided to make, and it should make the job of the defenders just that little bit easier, and it does actually give it a somewhat similar structure overall to the old version of Thranduil's Halls, in the sense that you have this outer fortification, and if need be you can then fall back to within Thranduil's Halls for a sort of secondary stand if you choose to, and there's this rather large open area in between, but time will tell whether we get to see that in action or not. Of course, Mirkwood are going to be the faction which are universally on the defence, as you would expect given the lore of this location. I believe this edited version of the map was called ERYN LASGALEN, but I may be wrong about that, I'll have to look that up. But yes, Mirkwood, plenty of quality, plenty of missiles, and if they are to win this particular battle, it will need to be on the strength of their missiles, because this is a 5v3. The elves are smaller factions by their very nature, and Mirkwood as well with their lighter armour. They work well as part of a combined defensive effort with maybe a slightly heavier faction, but their quality alone can leave them a little bit lightweight against a full invasion force such as this. We shall see how well they get on. I believe as well it's 5 Mordor armies that are on the attack. We'll start off with the attackers as we usually do. It's a very dense map with vegetation, this one, so that should help out Mirkwood actually, given the density of units that can hide from them. So Mordor are just going to have to sort of walk through the territory, and then Viet Cong style, I suppose, Mirkwood are going to be able to pop out from the shrubs and deal with Mordor as they move through. But the numbers of Mordor are such that they should be able to take a real beating before it becomes a problem for them. Morale on infantry, we've seen Mordor in the very last battle fight alongside their runic allies, and the morale on infantry, they're a very basic unit. I mean, they are shielded, their armour is not absolutely dreadful, but neither is it outstanding. Numbers are their main strength, and of course they're going to have to play Minesweeper as they go through the settlement as a whole. They're not going to beat anything really one-to-one in terms of melee quality when considering it's Mirkwood they're facing off against, so they're going to be leaning very heavily on that numbers aspect that they have. And to be fair, there are occasions where Mordor may feel as though they don't have to do that, because they do have some pretty decent high quality units of their own, but on this occasion, given the fact they're up against the elves, given the fact that it's very much on their home turf, on the kind of map they very much like to defend on, they're going to have to do that. And to be fair, with some of the more open areas of the map, as much as they are fighting on Mirkwood's home turf, Mordor should be able to take advantage of those numbers if they can swamp over the slightly more lightweight Mirkwood defenders. Moran on guard, we saw them in the last battle as well. They are the spear variant of the infantry we've already seen. The spear malice isn't really going to be their friend on this occasion though, given the fact that Mirkwood's melee defence is already going to make it quite difficult for Mordor to kill them with any regularity. Though there are a few cavalry units on the field, and Mirkwood's cavalry is a little bit fragile, so spears may very well be a good way of getting them to run, unfortunately, into them. Moran on archers, considering the shape of this map, getting their skirmishers into a decent position to return fire into the slightly more lightweight Mirkwood archers is something Mordor can certainly attempt to do, and the Moran on archers, that's pretty much their entire reason for being. Their armor values, as I've already said, are not absolutely dreadful, but the main thing they're going to be used for is getting a decent volume of arrows downrange as quickly as they possibly can. We've got some more Moran on infantry over here, more Moran on archers. Interesting that most of these Mordor units are not actually hidden. I'm glad that we're viewing this battle from the perspective of Mirkwood, because many of their units, I'm sure, within the terrain are going to be hidden as it stands. Orc Maulers, this is actually an interesting situation where the armour-piercing units among Mordor's roster are not actually going to be all that efficient. Mirkwood and Linden really do stand out as two factions within the game where armour-piercing is not really going to be all that useful. And they do offer a little bit more base damage, but their own melee defense is so terrible. The vast majority of Mirkwood's units are going to be able to kill them with relative impunity, including the archers, so they're going to be in for a tough time, the Orc Maulers. They're just going to be here basically as a de facto meat shield. Speaking of which, Uruk captains, they're shielded, they're well armoured, they're multiple HP, a bodyguard tier line infantry unit, which is all well and good when it comes to trying to mitigate the damage of the Mirkwood missiles that are inevitably going to be finding their way towards them. However, armour piercing is their main selling point when it comes to their abilities in melee, and as we've already mentioned, for the reasons we've already mentioned, not going to be quite so useful against Mirkwood. On the other hand, we're on halberds. Now, halberdiers are mostly known for the fact that they have armour piercing in combination with that phalanx formation, but Mirkwood have no phalanx units of their own. They're one of only two factions, with Rohan included, that do not have access to this. It's one of the main aspects of the game as well which contribute to its meta, I would say. Phalanx units are very, very important for playing in Reforged. Mirkwood kind of get around this with the sheer amount of quality and missile power they have. It means that enemy phalanx units, often the main way to deal with them as Mirkwood is to shoot them, and considering the fact Mordor have to advance into hostile territory here, that is going to be the main way that they choose to go about their business, I'm sure. But if it does come down to a ground war in melee later on and Mirkwood are out of ammunition, Mordor still have a few halberdiers, that can be the difference here. And Mirkwood do not have any direct answer to that. So they may not have the range of pikes, but against this opposition, they don't actually need it. One of the more sensible units Mordor can have in their lineup against a force like Mirkwood is going to be the Minas Morgul Chosen. They're not going to be the best at dealing damage to Mirkwood. Again, they're spears. They may not be as low tier as the Moran on Guard, but the spear malice still comes into play, especially when it comes to dealing with some of the higher end units, or units of a similar cost really to the Minas Morgul Chosen. But the heavy armour and the shields mean that they are going to be more resilient, and that's going to be key for Mordor here, outlasting and withstanding the Elven barrage. If they can do that, their numbers should do the rest of the work, given the 5v3 nature of this particular fight, and the Minas Morgul Chosen can be a central part of that. Around on infantry, another conundrum that many forces facing off against Mordor when they're on the attack have to deal with are the Orc Javelins. They're so cheap that you don't want to use valuable missiles on them. Now, I think Mirkwood, with the amount of archers they have at their disposal, may be a little bit more willing to use their archers early. We'll wait and see. But yeah, Cavalry is another way you can deal with them efficiently, but they're a real nuisance to deal with when Mordor have them as part of an attacking force. The Temple Executioners are actually one example of a unit which can genuinely go toe-to-toe with the very best the elves have to offer. Very, very strong unit of heavy swordsmen. They don't have the armour upgrade here, but it's not necessarily the most important thing for them because of their very high stats anyway. So yeah, one of the units in the Mordor roster which is certainly well equipped for going toe-to-toe with Thranduil's finest. We have some Sauron's Will in here also. Armour piercing, once again, not going to be terribly useful, though they are a better unit all round than the Orc Maulers, and their base damage does mean that they are at least going to be somewhat dangerous, especially to the more rank and file Mirkwood units, though still not going to be as efficient as they would otherwise be. More Orc Maulers and Olag High. Now, Trolls can actually be very useful against the Elves. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. The Elven units are so small that the damage Trolls can inflict is going to be very telling in a very short space of time, but the Elves also have the expertise to be able to bring the Trolls down quickly as well, so it's almost like a more extreme version of how the Trolls can react, both in terms of their positives and their negatives. Timing going to be everything here. If they can escape into the more open areas in behind the cliffs that we can see, then it could be a really painful time for the Elves. We'll go through the rest of the Mordor armies a little bit more quickly when talking about the same units, but Temple Inquisitors, a mounted unit which, again, given the fact that this is really a siege battle, but the more open areas of the map, especially if the initial defences start to crumble, if cavalry does start to roll over the defence, that could be a real concern moving into the later stages of the battle. So yeah, Temple Inquisitors here, potentially a real danger. And also any Mirkwood cavalry that does come after them, they may be single HP, but again, they are melee cavalry, so they do have some utility here. It is a custom scenario, let's not forget, so the armies were not picked by the players. Dominion R did not choose to bring the Temple Inquisitors, but here they are, and he will have to make use of them. Orc Maulers are here once again, more Moran Guard. Standard Orc Archers rather than the Moranons, so obviously not going to be quite as good, they're not going to be as resilient, they're not going to be as damaging, but they're going to be used in much the same way. Get them into a position where they've got a reasonable line of sight, shoot into the Mirkwood line and try and be just as annoying as you possibly can with them. And especially against a faction with lighter armour like Mirkwood, they can pay for themselves surprisingly easily. More Orc Archers, more Orc Maulers. I saw them skulking around over here as well, the Orc Fodder. The weakest dedicated infantry unit that Mordor have in their roster when it comes to melee. Spears, so Spear Malice comes into effect. Very, very low stats. Everyone will remember them basically ever since the original, where they were simply called Orcs, I believe, in Standard Third Age. Yeah, they're not going to be killing too many units, but as part of a combined front line, they can make for an intimidating Orc blob as it moves forward, though even that may be a little bit... You may want to reconsider if that's Mordor's main ploy here, given the fact that we will very likely be seeing Rangers on the defence for Mirkwood. More fodder, more infantry. Infantry and Maulers once more, so a lower end army this from Dominion R. Certainly no shortage in terms of numbers though. Moran Halberds useful for the reasons we've already mentioned. More Orc Javelins, Uruk Captains, slightly limited as we said as well, and more Olag High, another potentially deadly unit indeed. The central army is going to be Tuck the Gamer, so he has got more Moran Infantry. Several examples of this particular unit, some Orc Maulers, once again more Moran Halberds, one of the more important units I think. Now this could be a very decisive unit indeed, the Blackguard of Barad-dûr, not only for those big shields being able to mitigate the arrow fire that's going to be coming their way, but also the slightly more lightweight Elven front line is going to be more susceptible, I feel, to the mass pushes that the Blackguard of Barad-dûr can enact. Again, timing is going to be key, because if they do go at the wrong time and the elves are still strong enough, then the damage the elves can chuck out will deal with them pretty quickly, and they'll end up either just dying to the last orc or routing. But if it is used at the right time, it's the sort of weapon which the elves are not really all that well set up to deal with, at least not quickly. We've got more Sauron's Will, more Orc Maulers, more Orc Javelins and Archers, so again lower end archers this. We've got a few units we haven't seen as of yet, including the rather scary Nazgul, obviously individually, certainly able to withstand most of what the elves can throw at them, but very limited in terms of numbers. If they can embed themselves into these larger Mordor armies though, definitely a power spike that they can make very, very good use of, very high stats, very high HP, that sort of thing. Olag High, Uruk Captains once again. We've got another different type of cavalry this time in the shape of the green-clad Ardenaim Lancers, Black Númenóreans as they are. More of an aggressive cavalry this, again single HP, their heavy armour at least makes them a little bit more resilient than most single HP cavalry, though not to the point where they're really all that worthwhile if you're picking your own army. If they can get some good charges off, they could be worthwhile, but again they're lance cavalry, so the Mirkwood Cav, any of them really, is going to be enough to deal with them in melee, other than probably the Horse Archers. So yeah, I don't know, going to be difficult for Tuck to use them I think, but not impossible. Moran Guard, more Moran Guard, and we've already mentioned the Uruk Captains. Now the fourth of the 5 Mordor armies, we move on to Toblerone, including some random symbols that he's decided to add at the start of his name as well. Moran Guard, we have some Sauron's Will, plenty of Sauron's Will in fact. More Moran Guard, more Moran Infantry, more Temple Executioners, another very important unit for the reasons we've already mentioned. Have not seen any Minas Morgul chosen since the first Mordor army, and I already mentioned why they could be a very important unit, though maybe not in the smaller numbers we've seen them here. Moran Infantry, another unit of the mass-pushing Blackguard. The first example of a unit of Temple Guard we've seen as well. Armour-piercing arrows are not something that Mirkwood actually have in their arsenal, but Mordor do. So if they can get into a good position to shoot into some of the Mirkwood elites, that could prove to be, again, another decisive blow that Mordor can strike, and they only need to hit those critical targets a few times really for it to be a telling blow, and for Mirkwood to be really hard pressed to recover from it. So it's a dangerous target that, and Mirkwood will undoubtedly be trying their best to try and deal with them before they become a real issue. More Halberdiers, more Maulers, a couple of Orc Archers as well, and some more Uruk Captains, and the final Mordor army that we have to look at is going to be Hammer. He has got some Moran Infantry, Moran Archers as well, so some slightly bulkier regular archers once more on the 2 flanks of the halls. Maulers, we've got more Olag High, we've got yet more Halberdiers as well, so a decent amount of Halberdiers. Good target for all of those Mirkwood archers, but also potentially very, very useful later on for the reasons already mentioned. More captains and Moran on infantry, Maulers, infantry, Sauron's Will, Moran on guard, all of the standard fare, and some Orc javelins as well. Before we get into the settlement then, as we move on to the defenders, in these two little basins we do have the cavalry forces that are going to be activated a little bit later on, little relief forces if you will. Huntsmen of Amon Lank and Sindar of the Girdle, and then another unit of Huntsmen of Amon Lank over here. The single HP Huntsmen are very, very fragile, it must be said, both to melee threats and certainly to arrows, but they can be pretty decent in melee against other cavalry units, so if they can disable the Ardenheim Lancers, and even the Temple Inquisitors won't enjoy facing off against multiple examples of this unit, they could be very, very deadly. The Sindar of the Girdle, however, as a genuine multiple HP bodyguard tier cavalry, can be very, very deadly indeed if in the right hands. Still a little bit fragile in comparison to many other bodyguard cavalry units, but certainly not the sort of thing that Mordor are going to enjoy hammer and anvil strikes coming from. And I believe it's going to be much the same sort of thing over on this side as well from the Flame of Arnor. He too has got some bows, well actually no, he's got some bows of Amenduia, which weren't on the other side, so horse archers, more of an annoyance for Mordor than the genuine threat that charges can be, given the propensity to rout. And it doesn't look as though there's actually anything else other than a couple of units of bows of Amenduia here, so a dangerous cav force here in the sticks, but not necessarily utterly devastating from Mordor's perspective. Mirkwood won't be able to simply rely on the shock potential that cavalry does have. Now then, Ankles, another defender. There's a couple of units of upgraded Elven King's Palace Guard here, which is all well and good. 2 units of them on the front line. Mordor will be struggling to make headway against the damage that these Glaive Guard can do. But there's only so many of them. Small unit they are, and I don't know, we'll see. All the armour upgrades are going to be present here for Mirkwood, which will give them a little bit more resilience, given the fact that lower armour values tend to be a problem for them, but if you can upgrade all your armour across the board like this in a scenario setting, then it does make a difference. Hiri Lung, Hiri Alth and Hiri X, so the heavy swordsman, line infantry and spearman options in series, very, very nice. All of these units are going to be very efficient against most of what Mordor have. Elders of the Elven King, those Silverthorn arrows are going to blunt Mordor's momentum certainly, and they could actually be the answer for at least trying to slow up something like the Blackguard of Barad-dûr across the field. They're also very competent in melee, as you would expect. Well, some Hiri Peng as well as some Woodland Protectors, a couple of units of Hiri Peng, so heavier Elven Archers. As with most Elven Archers of this class, they're also perfectly competent in melee later on, which is going to be a factor. Mirkwood, all of their units are going to have to contribute in melee at some point if they are to be successful in their endeavours of defending their borders. Wardens of Amon Lank, they can hide anywhere of course, they're slightly more effective at range than the Hiri Pang, and not only that, but that two-handed axe they wield in melee gives them that armour-piercing edge, which is something elves actually do lack in melee a fair amount. Lothlorien are able to deploy a little bit more of it than Mirkwood and Imladris at any rate, but just having these kinds of units is going to be useful because, as we all know, armour-piercing is very useful against Orcish factions, given the fact that most of their defence comes from their armour. Some upgraded Hiri Peng there, some more Wardens of Amon Lank, Farkin being the other Mirkwood player, yet more Elders of the Elven King stationed up here. Woodland Realm Patrol are a more basic archer unit, but even these basic, slightly lighter Elven archers are still perfectly capable of chucking out quite a lot of damage, as long as they avoid getting into clear sight lines from the more numerous units of Orcish archers, and they can utilise their hiding mechanic to do so. They should be just fine. Greenwood Watchers are over here, an assassin class unit. They don't have too much ammunition, and in melee they are a little bit lightweight, but they are pretty damaging. It's a decent little damage spike they have, though the next patch I think will be kinder to assassin class units like the Watchers, another unit of Woodland Realm Patrol. A decent force here up front, as you would expect, Woodland Realm Axemen and Hiri Alth, so Woodland Realm Axemen, they can hide anywhere as well. A dual wielding unit combined with axes, so decently damaging, decently resilient in melee at the very least, but a little bit less so when it comes to trying to withstand arrow fire. Again, something that Mirkwood will be hoping to avoid. More Hiri Lung, more Hiri Alth and Hiri Ek, a couple of more units of Elven King's Palace Guard, so they're certainly not light in terms of bodyguard units, which is good because I think Mirkwood will need to lean on that quality a little bit more if they are to be successful here. 5v3 as it is on not a completely open map, but there are certain ways in which Mordor can make it a more open map if they're going to be really aggressive. Woodland Protectors, the Greenwood Ranger is going to be very important as well. Of course, Elven Rangers have got that extra point of damage on top of a unit type which is already extremely deadly. More Elders of the Elven King, more Woodland Realm Patrol up here, so as we were saying, Mirkwood going to be very heavily dependent on their archers to do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Flame of Arnor with his own Greenwood Rangers and Woodland Protectors up here, and another front line consisting of varying types of their mainline units, ERYN, Ek and Outh. Unit events, which we haven't seen too many of. Mordor certainly have more in the way of Olag High than Mirkwood have Ents on this occasion, but the same principle applies. If they're committed at the right time, they could be very, very useful indeed. Axemen, ERYN, Ornsvam on Lank, and then a few units here in the backfield, including another unit of Huntsmen, difficult for Ankles to use, but we'll see if he's up to the task, especially seeing as Mordor know where they're coming from if they're charging head on. Outh, Woodland Protectors, ERYN. Back here we have another rundown of heavier units, mostly Hiriak with, in fact entirely Hiriak, and then finally we have a unit of Elven King's Palace Guard here at the back. So I don't think there's going to be too much need to make too much of a cut here, because it's not an overly long battle, which makes me think we're probably not going to be seeing the interior of Thranduil's halls too much today, and we're instead going to be seeing largely the exterior fortifications being utilised. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. A rather imposing sight looking at it from this angle, isn't it, with those very, very steep cliffs, and in many ways it actually doesn't benefit the defenders as much as you might expect, purely because the way the Medieval 2's projectiles work, you cannot simply place your archers on the edge of these rather large natural formations and shoot down off the edge of them. You'd have to angle your own shots, so as much as it does funnel the map down certain routes, there are only certain positions really where the defending archers are going to be able to be really, really effective, and it's going to be off the sides of these interior ramps, I think, shooting into the sides of the attackers as they do decide to move through these choke points. Other than that, I can't really see this large outer quote-unquote wall actually being utilised too much by the defenders, other than perhaps to be used as the last stand as a possible way of retreating, I guess, in a weird kind of way, if they do not want to go back into the halls themselves, but we'll see if that ends up being the case or not. I like the fact that the stakes have been placed down, though again the amount of cavalry that the attackers actually have is fairly limited, and indeed actually the heavier cavalry presence is for the defenders on this particular occasion, so I don't know whether or not that may actually end up being a bit of a hindrance later on, but we'll see. Especially given the amount of tree cover on this map, and most of the tree cover as well in the interior, which this basin is where pretty much all, surely, of the action is going to be. A little bit of fire at will going on there, not the sort of ammunition you need to be wasting as the defenders. 5v3s like this ammunition count is very, very important, especially given how reliant upon projectiles Mirkwood are almost certainly going to be in a battle like this, but we'll see. It's not the longest battle in the world either, so I imagine Mordor are going to be really, really aggressive, and that is the best way to be, I think. When being conservative in a situation like this is all well and good if you have a set plan of wearing the enemy's ammunition supply down, but too often I see when people are being conservative, they're not actually doing a fantastic job of wearing the ammunition down, they're just sending forward infantry in too small amounts to actually make even a scratch on the defending infantry lines. That means that the defenders can still actually conserve a fair amount of their ammunition, and not a great deal of progress ends up getting made around on infantry moving forward. We will maybe make a little bit of use of half speed when the battle truly gets underway, at least temporarily, just because while there are only 3 choke points, I imagine things are going to get underway fairly quickly. There's a V-shaped formation here as well, and they do actually lurch forward, so not content to simply allow the attackers to move as they will. Yeah, we will go down to half speed just on a temporary basis, I think, but I don't know about this. I mean, Hiriak are a very strong unit of spears with that armour upgrade, tough to kill off, but the trolls, if they were to face off against one of Mirkwood's higher end units, then they would have chosen the spears, just because they will take a little bit less damage from them in comparison to something like the ERYN. Forward come the Blackguard of Barad-dûr as well pretty quickly. In terms of their survivability, maybe not the worst unit to bring forward first, though I would argue that it's better off to know the lay of the land and to see all of Mirkwood's infantry and where their positions are before you send forward a unit which is designed to do mass pushing primarily. Meanwhile, yeah, ERYN firing from the side, so they do have those good positions like I mentioned on those ramps, and they are going to be firing in to the attacking forces, and some contact has already been made. Orc Maulers in the vanguard, though, as I mentioned in the composition phase, I really wouldn't rate the chances of the Orc Maulers in most of these conflicts all that highly, given the fact that armor piercing, while it's not going to be completely wasted against Mirkwood, against their heavier units anyway, their own melee defense is going to be a real problem against this level of Elven unit. Orc Javelins being sent forward first is a bit of a bold call. Not sure I necessarily agree with that one. We did see as well the bows of Amenduia up on the side over there, but they're not ready to fully commit themselves just yet. And over here on the left hand side of the settlement, still they're moving forward slowly, but they're not ready to yet fully commit themselves to the fray. Back up to full speed, I think. The trolls are still very much alive as well. ERYN, there are Elven King's Palace Guard in there now though, and up against the Palace Guard the Olag High should start to fall away fairly fast. Yeah, the positioning of those Greenwood Rangers I think is going to be absolutely devastating. And up on those positions is where the Rangers can best find themselves useful. Lots of damage can be done to Mordor, and lots of damage will need to be done to Mordor as they make their way forwards, because if they do attack very aggressively in the kind of numbers that they're threatening to do, even with the quality of Mirkwood, I wouldn't fancy their chances holding on forever. Flaming Shot being utilised, that's the sort of thing which can certainly induce a fair amount of panic in the Orcish ranks. Wooden Realm Axeman as well, getting into melee, and they should actually be very, very efficient in a pure melee engagement against much of the regular Orcish units. You can see already lots have been committed. There's not a huge amount of reinforcement zone, that's the issue. Mirkwood can bulk up on the front line initially, but there's only so far in the battle this is going to be able to take them. So DPS quickly at range is going to be the key here, I think. And the Greenwood Rangers do start to fire again. That is the kind of blob and this is the kind of angle that is perfect really for Rangers. They'll offer the damage. Flaming Shot will offer morale hits as well. All things that you want to be seeing. This is a little bit more worrying, I would suggest, for Mirkwood though, because gaps have been found. Hammer has been able to find more purchase on the Elven positions just because there wasn't as much of a set-up front line as there was on the front. And they may live to regret that, because this is the kind of situation where Orcs are starting to wash over front lines that is not going to be seen too positively. The ERYN is still firing, but there's only so long surely that they're going to be able to do that before Mordor are upon them in melee. There are sections of this front line which are still reasonably solid with heavier Mirkwood units, but they're starting to get surrounded now, and Orcish bodyguard units are also central to that effort. So I don't know, I'm not really liking that particular situation. Orc Javelins are also pouring forwards morale on infantry. The situation needs to be salvaged here, and maybe a little bit naive of the defending infantry here, which is a combination of many different armies actually, to think that they could get away with offering Mordor that much space and that they wouldn't take it. If you compare that to the situation over here, Mordor are still getting some of their units behind enemy lines, but it's far more damaged, and actually Mirkwood is still very, very comfortable on this front line because they've managed to front load their defence. It is also worth saying as well that there is range support coming in from both sides rather than just one over here. And over here as well, the front line is holding, though over here they've maybe set their front line a little bit further forwards. They've still got a decent position for their archers, which makes it acceptable. But the possibilities of range support are a little bit less severe for the attackers than they would be as they try to move through that central choke point. We can still see as well ERYN, heavier Mirkwood units again central to this effort. But there are a few of the lighter units as well, and the Woodland Realm Axemen, as I've already mentioned, against Morannon class units should be a fairly efficient pick. And we are now starting to see the bows of Amenduia come in and start shooting into the backs of this army over here, going after some Sauron's Will. A good choice. The damage is still dangerous, even if the armor piercing isn't quite so much, but trying to pick away at more of the manpower here from this army. A luxury which over on the other side will have to be garnered by lance cavalry, which that could be the sort of thing to help reverse some of the momentum that Mordor now have. And as I suspected, given the length of this battle overall, the fact that it is a 5v3 as well with plenty of numbers on the field, it's proving to be a very violent affair so far. Flaming shot being used very liberally by the elves, which of course consumes more ammunition, so you're going to get less kills overall, but especially against some of the more entry-level orcs, I do think it's worthwhile because it's going to be fairly easy to rout them off, and routing off orcs by the 100 is one of the better ways to deal with the situation. I think the trolls, they are still alive, though damaged. These ERYN have been firing away for quite a while at this point. The orcs have still actually yet to completely get to them in melee, which I find a little bit surprising as well. Getting hung up on those Woodland Realm axemen. So as much as Mordor do have... As much as Mordor do have the momentum on their side here, they need to make sure that they continue to be aggressive and continue to find those gaps in the Mirkwood position, because there are still plenty to exploit. They have a fair amount of map control over here at this point, Mordor, so there's no need to rest on their laurels now. In fact, I would suggest getting all of your units in and maybe leaving a single unit of halberdiers or something to plug the gap to make sure reinforcing cavalry doesn't get to you is probably the way to go. And then maybe try and get some units to the middle as well to help ease the passage of your allies, try and get that domino effect going in favour of the attackers, which we've seen so often in Reforged in the past. Horns of Amon-Lenk are going to butcher their way through morale on infantry, but this is also a real problem because now that the attacking cavalry is behind enemy lines and they've got plenty of room to run into, especially the Ardenheim Lancers, if they can get those Lancers down, get a few good charges off, you can get a lot of value very quickly against high tier elves with a swift cavalry charge or two. It says on the front line now that Mordor starting to have a little bit more joy, and surely a big part of that is the fact that they've got their halberdiers here, and as I mentioned in the composition phase, Mirkwood have no such luxury. They have no phalanx units, they have to rely on missiles to shoot their way through this kind of situation, otherwise they do end up decorating the end of enemy polearms all too easily. At the very least, those missiles do offer them the ability to do that, unlike the poor fools that ride with the Rohirrim in this version of the game. Far and away the least impressive faction, I think, Rohan, which is a bit of a shame. Huntsmen of Amon-Lenk charging in, so finding their own gaps as well with that one unit of cavalry that was in the defensive position. Going after the Orc Javelins and Orc Archers, they're trying to offer a little bit of support at range for the attackers over here, which is better than nothing. Certainly not up to the same level as the kind of horrific damage Mirkwood have been inflicting, but by the same token, Mordor may have taken a lot of losses over here, but they're still very much in the fight. But it is still over here, I think, that the most significant battles are taking place. Those Orc Maulers are routing, Greenwood Rangers getting charged, although based on the fact that they are moving away, I don't know if they still actually have ammunition left or not. Good use of those Ardenheim Lancers, I think, actually would be enough to put this battle beyond Mirkwood already. And we are only in basically still the opening passage of play here. And also, based on how close they are to the entrance of the halls, there may not be the opportunity to retreat even for Mirkwood. They may have to simply fight and die out here on the plains. There are elements of this defence over here which are still doing quite well. I mean, they still had a lot of units over here, Mirkwood, let's not forget, so parts of this defensive effort are not going to go down without a substantial fight. Surrounding is going to have to be employed. Ardenheim Lancers are there. Sauron's Will trying to chase the Elders of the Elven King. Yeah, and it's this sort of thing that I would really worry about. Ironically, it's actually a Mordor general that falls there. I don't know if they actually got their Lancers down there. I think that was more of a clumsy bump than anything else. Well, ooh, just in time to see ERYN being peeled off the front line, which I don't know why. Mirkwood front line still looks in fairly good shape. The Minas Morgul's chosen are trying to push through. They don't have access to a unit of Blackguard over here, I suppose, so they're trying to go for the other approach, and this is exactly the sort of thing which Mordor can inflict. It's something that I mentioned being a little bit worried about from a Mirkwood perspective earlier on in the fight. Defeat seems almost certain. Elven King's Palace Guard moving back, so the two flanks looking like they're in fairly bad shape. I mean, the line was fighting well, but of course Mordor, with their superior numbers and mass, not playing the game with Mirkwood. You should never play into the hands of your enemy, and Mordor taking advantage of the perks that having this kind of army gives you. You can already tell as well, based on the minimap, that several elements of the Mirkwood army are already retreating back to within the Elven halls. And I think that's because they can tell. I mean, even though they are still fighting the good fight here in the central choke point, they've just been pushed out the way on the left. The fight on the right has been chaotic for a good long time. The cavalry is here. However, looks like they did manage to get some decent charges in. Looks like the Temple Executioners have been damaged. But the amount of value you need to get with cavalry units like this is pretty substantial. Huntsman of Ammon Lank get another charge. Single HP cavalry though. Again, you can see non-knight cavalry is so underwhelming in that sort of situation. It's not even as if those Temple Executioners were fully healthy. They'd already taken a bit of damage, and yet that charge caught them full flush on the front. 0 damage from the initial charge. Very, very disappointing. The second one killed off a few, but still, having to work that hard just to kill off 4 infantry units is part of the reason why I just think single HP cavalry in this version of the game is so poor. So poor. If you get given it in a custom scenario like this, you have to try and make the best of it, I suppose, though. Sindar of the Girdle will be up to a little bit more, but still pockets of resistance out here from Mirkwood trying to kill off as much of the Mordor invaders as they can before we will get to see the interior of Thranduil's halls. At least that is the model that's being used. I think I will give this map a different name, however, seeing as we will be seeing the actual Thranduil's halls map coming up in the next few weeks as well, so there's bound to be other Elven holds within Mirkwood that I can pick as a name for this one. Further over here, still a decent strong point of Mirkwood infantry. On the way across now, Mordor Orc Javelins getting into place. Not actually firing at anything in particular. Sindar of the Girdle, Temple Inquisitors are in the field over here as well. Attacking cavalry, being able to get good value off is the sort of thing which you have to be slightly worried about if you're the defenders regarding your chances going into the later game. Yeah, and this is exactly why they have been going after the right kind of targets with their cavalry. Whether the cavalry has cooperated in terms of getting its full charge potential off into the Mirkwood infantry has been a little bit more variable, but they have been going after the right things, and the attackers don't need their cavalry necessarily to be as impressive as the defenders need theirs to be. And to be fair, the defenders have been able to find a few targets with their own cavalry. Sindar of the Girdle feasting upon some Morannon archers, and there were some maulers over here and also Morannon infantry, so plenty of squishier targets. And volume of kills is actually going to be very important here as well, because they're going to need to make some serious dents in the Mordor manpower. You can see here this is also the main weakness of the Mirkwood cavalry. It is weak to sustained arrow fire, even basic arrows like the ones the Orc archers would be providing. Over time will be enough to deal with the Sindar of the Girdle without too many dramas. Olag High is still proving to be a problem as well, offering that little bit of extra damage. Interestingly enough, Mirkwood seem to have been victorious over here. It's always difficult to see what's going on beneath the tree cover. This is where ultimately the Mordor cavalry did manage to find its way into the settlement, but it does look as though the Mordor efforts over on this side of the settlement at the very least did kind of fizzle out. The consequences of Mordor's initial aggressive push over here have been felt throughout the battlefield though, so even if Mordor did technically peter out, with the cavalry playing a part of that as well, so the Mirkwood cavalry has proven to be a factor Mordor across the rest of the battlefield have managed to reap the benefits of this. Mirkwood's still fighting well on the front line as well. Starting to get shaken now though, and that's always a poor sign when Mirkwood is shaken in the face of Morannon units. The trolls are there as well, but it takes a lot to rout elves. You know the fight is not necessarily developing in your favour. Most of those elves are pointing the wrong way, which is probably not helping matters. Morannon infantry trying to save yet more as they retreat to the halls. Just get an idea as well. It's very even, 2%, and technically speaking 3% as well. Technically speaking that's in favour of the defenders as well, though 5v3s, it can very often be the late game where things rebalance themselves, although the thing that is always very difficult to really quantify as the battle goes along is how much damage the ranged units are doing, and that is such an important part of what Mirkwood tried to do in most fights. So really it comes down to whether or not Mordor have the manpower left after receiving that savaging to take over a defensive position like those halls. Still actually Palace Guard in here as well. Only one. Making his final stand amongst the sea of foul orcs and trolls. Being concealed by the Bannock area now. Minas Morgul chosen all around him, a few orc archers as well. I think that was it, yeah, he ended up getting trampled underfoot there, and I think that's pretty much it. Other than the possibility of some cavalry, Huntsmen of Amon Lank making a nuisance of themselves, Temple Inquisitors trying to catch them, but being given the runaround there. The amount of kills they can get now with the unit in the state that it's in is going to be pretty limited, but they'll do what they can. 96 Minas Morgul's chosen. Still the sounds of battle going on over there, so there may be still some disparate Elven units. There's still some stuff over here as well. It's the cavalry, Bows of Amenduia, Huntsmen of Amon Lank, all trying their best to kill off as much of this one unit of Morannon archers as they can. As I mentioned, going after, trying to whittle away at Mordor's manpower is still going to be very important if they want to go on to win this fight, and actually the final 10k frames are very likely to be the assault on the Elven halls themselves, so once again that rather clumsy metric that I use actually does prove to be somewhat useful. Temple Inquisitors continuing to chase. Bows of Amenduia take a loss or two each time they move in. The Huntsmen of Amon Lank still moving around. This is really the only thing that's happening at the moment while Mordor march their way forwards. And yeah, this is what I was kind of wondering. I didn't really know why Farkin had decided to retreat all of his cavalry within the halls. It's not going to be very useful in there. This is when it will be at its most useful, when Mordor are trying to cross the open field before getting into the halls themselves. And the amount of damage you're going to be able to do is relatively small with each individual charge, but it is all going to add up. And given the fact that they already hold a minor percentage lead, Mirkwood could lean on their quality late on as the battlefield starts to get more and more focused. Temple Inquisitors finishing off one of the less healthy units of cavalry. And he's retreating his cav again. I don't really know why he's saving them. There's a situation like this where I really would like to hear what the player is actually, what the thought process is behind saving the cav. In a siege battle, if you get to the very end and you're starting to gain the upper hand as the defenders and you can escape with your cavalry and get some rear charges, it is the sort of thing which can act as a coup de grace on the attackers, but it's such a risk to do that because you may never get the opportunity to. Your cavalry might end up bottled up against the wall, facing off against spears, in which case you've gained nothing by saving them for later. But But I don't know. We may never know in a situation like this. As we see, yeah, they're setting up a very nice infantry front line. As we often see from the interior of this layout of Elven halls, like the main thing to do really is just to set up a very, very solid front line on the doors, on the front. I think I've only ever seen one battle where we saw a sort of widespread conflict within these halls. And it was neat to see, but it was also not necessarily the cleverest thing for the defenders to do in a situation like that, and I feel like probably doing the right thing by simply stacking up on the front and making it a smaller battlefield, trying to make the most of your quality. Mordor could try and use mass, but that is a dangerous thing to do in this situation, as was mentioned. It's contracted a little bit once again. The defenders only ahead by 1%, so given the fact that it is a 5v3 and even with a percentage lead, the numbers Mordor have left are still far, far greater than the ones Mirkwood will have left. Hyper-aggression and trying to use mass probably is still the best thing Mordor could be doing in this situation. Will that be how they decide to approach it, though? An Elven banner carrier. The rest of his unit is in the... This is something which has always happened on this bridge as well. I don't know why. Pathfinding in Medieval 2 when it comes to this sort of thing has always been... I don't know, sorcery. Don't know how they... to make it work fully, it's a form of black magic. Whenever you just place a bridge and expect it to work, it very rarely goes the way that you would expect. I don't know what's going on over here. It almost looks like steam coming out because the waterfall itself is not fully complete. Mirkwood have discovered steam power, probably the least likely faction in Middle-earth to have done such a thing. Maybe Thranduil needs to find a way of more effectively blow-drying his hair. Nothing else? Mordor? I mean, the onus is on them. They've pretty much stacked up their full force at this point, so... Again, it's a situation like this, like, why do you hesitate? Why do you wait? The enemy is there, they are not going anywhere, they are not going to come out and meet you, they are not going to give you any extra accommodations for waiting. Further in. Oh, yeah, and this is the kind of thing which customs settlements are always a real pain for, getting stuck in the roof. Mordor, the OG at doing that. One Olag High moving in. Just for fun, I suppose. Will he be able to kill off any elves? Nope. He dies off. Orc Maulers, the first proper infantry unit that's still somewhat healthy to make their way in. And unsurprisingly, projectiles finding their way into the Mordor mass almost immediately. Ones of Amon Lank. Yeah, and stuff like the Elders of the Elven King. I don't think a mass push can be completely stopped by Silverthorn arrows, but just based on the way that Silverthorn arrows work, it should at least make Mordor's life a little bit more awkward in doing that. Not going to be able to force path your units forward quite so easily, and there's also just the straight up damage that the Elders of the Elven King are going to be capable of doing at long range, and then later on, of course, they will be a significant threat to Mordor in melee as well, as if stuff like these upgraded Palace Guard weren't already enough. As much as I mentioned the benefits of the Minas Morgul chosen earlier on, Palace Guard are not the unit that they would like to be fighting if they could at all help it. But now we shall settle in, I suppose, because this is going to be the decisive engagement. Mirkwood, let's not forget, held a 1% only advantage going into the late game here. This is the kind of engagement which should be good for the defenders in many ways. They've got a nice mass of units that they can shoot into and do a lot of damage at range. The battlefield is relatively small, so their quality should also be used well. But if Mordor can find a gap in that front line and start to overrun it with their numbers, it could all be over. Only 12 Elders of the Elven King there, but still with a bit of ammunition. Firing across a reasonably straight shot. More Elders of the Elven King. Greenwood Rangers still being alive from the Flame of Arnor. If they have got a flat shot, if they're ripping through the enemy, then that could honestly be, and yeah, that's a decent arc of fire. That could honestly be enough to make the difference all on its own. Range is so dangerous, but Mordor, they do have a unit of Blackguard, of Barad-dûr. They're taking losses at a very significant rate, however, and I don't think actually, based on the fact they do have some extra units, including some cavalry to plug the gap if need be, I don't think that they're going to be able to push through with sheer mass here. Mordor definitely did the right thing by holding those Blackguard of Barad-dûr back in reserve, but with some ERYN coming into the front line, the Huntsmen just adding their own mass as well. The mass of cavalry is significant as well, so they have found a use for themselves here, preventing Mordor from trying to bully Mirkwood out of the way. Exactly the right thing for Mordor to try and do in this situation, but Mirkwood had the tools necessary to counteract that. Still going though. I'm surprised they haven't routed already, actually, the Blackguard of Barad-dûr. They only have 20 of their number left. Charge coming in from the Sindar of the Girdle. Surely, if that connect... well, they're going to die anyway, in their entirety, but they pushed Mirkwood back a little bit more. If Mordor have got more units that they can commit forward to the front line, then maybe they should, but unfortunately for Mordor, they're also tied up on the other side, so you have to say that mass push did ultimately end in failure. Bit of a roll of the dice that for Mordor, and it didn't actually end up paying off, so Mirkwood may find themselves with a decent amount of hope going into the latter stages here. Moving forwards now. Orc fodder. Orc fodder still alive in this quantity in the late game is not maybe not the heroes that Mordor required of the situation, but just got to throw everything you have left into the situation now and hope that you have enough. But based on that failed mass push, kind of like Mirkwood's situation now. The Greenwood Rangers doing the damage, Elders of the Elven King. I think the quality of Mirkwood is going to be far too much, and without being able to wash over the ranks, which that Blackguard Barad-dûr mass push probably was their gambit to do so, Mordor, I don't think they're going to have the minerals necessary to be able to overcome the elves here. And fighting on home turf, 5v3s usually go the way of the attackers more often than not, but we may be seeing a defender victory here. People always like it when the elves are able to pull off something like this. Going into the latter stages, they really ought to be able to, I think. One Olag High remains in and amongst the ERYN with their two-handed swords, so I can't imagine he's going to last for too much longer. Still a decent amount of Palace Guard left as well. Mordor will probably have a bit of quality left of their own. Did of course see the Temple Guard previously. Woodland Realm Troll. I'm glad to see that Mordor either don't know of it or are not exploiting it, but I think on this variation of Thranduil's Halls, and perhaps on any variation, but the fact that you can actually go outside and occupy this position over here, I think you can actually shoot through this roof. I think it's not actually a solid entity with arrows, so I'm glad that Mordor either don't know of that or are not exploiting that fact to their advantage, because that would be obviously a little bit goofy and a little bit gamey. Yeah, Mirkwood actually actively pushing Mordor back now and making the battlefield even smaller, which is probably the last thing Mordor needed. Uruk captains, a whole bunch of Orc archers as well, so the numbers continue to flow. A few gaps being found, but I can't imagine those Orc archers are going to affect anything. In fact, by pushing through into the Mirkwood position that far. The only thing they're likely to be able to achieve is their own routing. Woodland protectors, of course, javelins as well, so maybe running their ammunition supply from long range a little dry, but a bit more close range punch certainly isn't going to hurt anything. There's another Mordor general, and the morale is going to come into play here. They're still not liking Mirkwood's chances, the announcer, which surprises me a little bit. Having a look at the percentages of kills, yeah, I mean they're pulling ahead here. They're now ahead by 8 whole percentage points, the defenders. And with the quality they still have, it should be enough. It's a sign, I suppose, of the sheer scale of the numbers discrepancy at the opening of a fight when it's 3 Elven factions versus 5 Orcish factions. And there we go, the announcer now finally sees the light. Looks like there's some routing being ingrained in the enemy ranks. Of course, no more ranger ammunition, but the fact that Flame of Arnor had that unit of rangers... Actually, no, those are ranger projectiles, aren't they? Or are they? Yes, there they are, still firing away. The fact that he still had that unit of Greenwood Rangers here in the late game, presumably with full ammunition as well, in a bottleneck like this, it's devastating. Elven Rangers have got that little bit of extra damage compared to normal Rangers as well, so it was always going to be very, very painful. We saw as well the frontal choke point in this settlement. Mordor suffered there. They did a pretty decent job on the 2 flanks, and that is ultimately what caused Mirkwood to retreat maybe a little bit sooner than they otherwise would have done, but we're seeing here what I don't really want to call it the crutch that the defenders are using here, but it is kind of true. Though it is more understandable in Mirkwood's case. I mean, being heavily reliant on archers is one of the defining traits of their faction as a whole, so the fact that the defenders are playing them like this is kind of the way the game intends, but it is worth mentioning that rangers will be very different in future versions of the game, and it will not be the case forever. Make use of it while you can. Even then, even without that, I don't know if Mordor would have had enough though. Even if the rangers hadn't been body piercing, even if they had just been very damaging archers, that's still a lot of damage they would have been able to do in this situation. I feel like almost the perfect kind of battle for Mirkwood, this. Opportunity to use their missiles out in the more open areas outside of the halls, and then later on in a single bottleneck to do the same. And it's clearly a sign that with the arrows still falling down upon Mordor, that Mirkwood have been rationing their ammunition to a decent extent. Forward come the Wardens of Amon Lank again. Sindar of the Girdle charging in. Kind of bumping into their own men though. It's not going to be the easiest thing to actually get a clean charge off. There is another Mordor general there, but not too much in the way of threats to his immediate life. This is going to be beyond 10% as well, so it's going to be a fairly domineering victory this for the defenders. Probably closer to 13 or 14% the differential by the time this battle reaches its conclusion. Another Mordor general falls. Do they actually have anything left outside the settlement? Probably not much. Or captains are routing. Yeah, they do, but it's all out of ammunition skirmishes, probably intended as a final wave. But they're not going to be able to achieve too much of anything, unfortunately. Orc archers and javelins are not what you need in melee against ERYN and Elven King's Palace Guard and Wardens of Amon Lank. And once again we see an example, really, in a battle like this, of where quality has seen them over the line. Mordor's generals dropping like flies. Not a single Mirkwood general has fallen in this battle either. So it may feel like a fairly crushing victory for Mirkwood, but it wasn't always that way. It wasn't an absolute domination. It is going to be a significant victory, but it is one of those situations where things could have worked out differently. We'll go into that a little bit more in the imminent endgame splash screen, but as we see the final sallying forth, Wardens of Amon-Lank in the vanguard, getting a few more kills for their coffers. Unsurprisingly, the Orc Archers rout almost immediately at the hands of this Elven assault. A little bit more damage being done by the Orc Javelins. We of course won't be able to see the kills that Mordor got, but it's probably better this way round. The numbers of kills that Mirkwood have. Very interested to see how the Rangers did. Indeed, there they are. The heroes of the hour, I would suggest. And routing en masse, unsurprisingly. The Uruk captains may very well rout as well. Or it may be an admission of defeat. Yeah, more damage and still a bit of ammunition left. And there we go. Yeah. Actually, you know what? 11% the difference in the end, so again, not the most domineering victory we've ever seen, but you could see where the battle was won and lost. Ultimately, what could Mordor have done differently? I think over in that choke point over there, where they did have that early success, where a little bit more room was afforded to them, which could have been disastrous for Mirkwood. On more situations than not, we see the attackers win as a result of that, but I feel like the Mordor player that was over there maybe wasn't given the extra support. Like, they sent more of their forces right through the middle, which of the initial defences, that's where Mirkwood were able to do most of their damage. So again, Mordor maybe with a few extra units. They got their cavalry in behind enemy lines. If they were able to back that up with a little bit more infantry on the side, they were winning. That could have made all the difference in the world. The other side as well was actually more of a footnote of an engagement, really, until Mordor saw the fact that they were in the ascendancy elsewhere and they knew that this layer was falling. That's when they decided to really push forward and go through on the left-hand side as well. But from a defending perspective, it was the central choke point initially, which was the most significant one, and it's the one where Mirkwood were able to do the best work. So again, it's one of those slightly odd situations where, in spite of the good things the attackers did, ultimately the damage that they were sustaining while doing so ended up not being sustainable. And Mirkwood were also able to maintain enough of their skirmish ammunition for the fight within the halls itself that, in a situation that would be considered fairly even in most siege battles, Mordor must have looked at that and gone, we're in real trouble here. There's not really any way we can make this work for us, other than hoping that we can mass push through with that one unit of Blackguard of Barad-dûr and make the fight messy. And they weren't able to do that. And even then, it would have been unclear whether they would have had the quality to deal with Elders of the Elven King in melee in that sort of quantity. They had some quality of their own left, but maybe not enough. So it could very well be that before the battle for the interior even started, Mordor were in almost a non-winnable situation. But like I said, 11% as a differential, considering all of those factors, is actually not that much, and it wouldn't have taken too much in terms of missteps from the defenders to turn this battle around. And I do think the defenders do deserve credit, because they committed their resources well where they needed to. Again, they did lean pretty heavily on stuff like the Rangers in order to achieve this victory, and positioning on maps like this is easier for Rangers, but still, you have to play the map that's in front of you, you have to shoot the targets that are correct, and that's exactly what they did. The one thing that I would say the defenders are quite fortunate in is they did allow the attackers space on that side, and when you see the Orcs pouring through gaps like that, under normal circumstances the defenders get punished dearly for that sort of thing. They weren't on this occasion, but most of the time they would be, so that's worth bearing in mind as well. But yeah, let's see what did the damage for Mirkwood. Only 70 kills for that unit of Elders of the Elven King, but unsurprisingly perhaps we do see a unit of Rangers breaking 1,000 kills, which, considering the blob they were firing into, not too surprising there. ERYN also doing very, very well for themselves. All of the archers, really. One of the units of Greenwood Watchers not doing quite so well, but plenty of other kills to go around. Everything really breaking at least 100, several breaking 200. a few even going up into the, again, 429 kills, 2 units of Greenwood Rangers in an army is a lot of firepower to be dealing with if you're the attackers. Though no Greenwood Rangers in this particular army, so I guess it does even itself out in that regard. Wardens of Amon-Lank getting over 400 kills, several units in the Elven lineup getting a ton of kills, which is what you need in this situation. Let's not forget the odds that they were almost certainly faced with numbers-wise. ERYN getting over 300 kills, plenty of units getting over 200 as well. Very, very rare that a unit got under 100. That unit of ERYN a little bit disappointing, but the odd disappointment is not really too much of a problem when you're considering the amount of kills that they got. But yeah, look at that. Like, a single Mirkwood army was outnumbered by a single Mordor army by at least 1,000. And then you can obviously extrapolate that out into a 5v3 as well. So yeah, big thank you to the Flame of Arnor for creating this custom scenario and sending it in. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of it. And at least for the moment, this little run of custom scenarios that people have made on either completely new maps or slightly edited maps, such as this one, has come to a temporary end. And it's been a really neat little run, actually, that we've been on of these custom maps, and hopefully people will continue to make them as well. Technically speaking, I do have another one coming out. I think it won't be the next battle, but the one after that, it will be one of Lord of Belagost's historical ones, although again, that's more of a pitch battle focused one, based on the third invasion of Gondor. So it's not like an all new map that has been developed for that one. But yeah, and it's also heartening to see that it's not just one person that's making these. We've had some from Tommy the Wise, we've had some from the Flame of Arnor, we've had one from the Womb Raider as well. So yeah, hopefully this sort of thing will continue and we'll get to see more of this, because as I've mentioned a couple of times already at the end screens of these when I've been talking about them, until the new patch comes out, this is really going to be one of the driving forces behind the game, I think. Because not only is it new content, or at least, you know, partially new content, but it's interesting. You know, more people getting involved in the actual creation of content for Reforged, I think, can only be a good thing, and it will be enough to keep things fresh and keep things going until hopefully later on, sometime this year, we will get to see the new patch in action. And there is every chance as well that ahead of the new patch coming out, there will be a couple more preview battles, not unlike the ones we did for the Rovanian capital, for Caer Andros, and for Dol Guldur towards the tail end of last year. We may very well get to see that sort of thing again, considering the fact that the Dol Guldur faction is in active development, and I'm not too sure about ERYN. We'll see. The sort of thing which could get a preview before it comes out, but that's the sort of thing which we will only know closer to the time. As for the immediate future, though, like I said, another historical battle coming up. I think the very next battle we will be seeing is going to be a big-scale siege, a really long siege as well, of Minas Morgul that was sent to me by 2 times. We do have an upcoming battle on the standard, well, I say that, a slightly edited version of the actual Thranduil's Halls map, which was sent to me by Winged Swordsman 44. Good to see another battle from him. And I will also do one of the rather interesting free-for-alls that the Womb Raider sent me actually some time ago at this point, but I just haven't got round to them yet. One of them will be next, and I think I'll consult him on which one he would rather see first. So that'll be a sort of large-scale cityscape free-for-all, which we'll also be seeing coming up in the next couple of weeks or so. So got about 2.5 weeks worth of stuff still on the backlog which I can do, and at this point I am recording basically a month ahead of time, so I've already built up that backlog that I wanted to. So we'll be maintaining this current situation. But yeah, enough of my rambling. Big thanks to the Flame of Arnor for the content he's provided over the course of the past month or so. Big thanks to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.